78,983. That is the number of COVID-19 related deaths recorded in South Africa so far. More than a year since the pandemic began, many have stopped checking the daily numbers released by government, either because life has simply moved on or because of pandemic fatigue. But behind the numbers are people who've left behind loved ones, neighbours, colleagues, and patients for thousands of healthcare workers who've been treating people who have ended up admitted to hospital. How then do we deal with the collective grief and mourning as a country? Zolani Metu is a mental health consultant and is with us to talk through some of these questions. Zolani, grateful for your time on this Saturday. Welcome to Newsfeed PM. Let's just begin with the very fact that we're all grieving and mourning under such unusual, unprecedented times, and how that has complicated the journey or the experience to an extent.
Sure. No, thanks a lot for that, Tembegile. Very good day to you and your viewers. I think you're absolutely right. We are finding ourselves in quite unprecedented times. And I think, beyond just us grieving, there's something that we'd refer to as disenfranchised grief as practitioners. And that really speaks to the idea of a grieving process that has not been acknowledged, or a grieving process that has not been legitimized through societal standards or social expectations of how people grieve. And this can be quite easily, conflated with complicated grief in most cases, but it really speaks to the idea that when grief is unrecognized, it surely does manifest in, multiple ways. And I think that's what we're seeing in South Africa today. And I'm really hoping that we actually can speak about some of those manifestations, because we see them at an individual level, Tembegile, but they also show up at a community level, where you're seeing really people, showing that they've lost something, whether you've lost income, whether you've lost a relationship, an intimate partner, or you've lost a loved one through death. And in all those cases, there's a grieving process that often needs to take place. But unfortunately, when that grief is not necessarily recognized or legitimized, it becomes quite difficult for people to go through the sort of normal stages of grief, and may, in fact, at a later stage, develop into a complicated form of grief.
And there's a sense, isn't there, with the different waves of COVID-19, that even when you've lost a friend, a loved one to COVID-19, just as you're mourning their passing, someone else in your circle loses a loved one, or someone else that you know, and it feels as if you sort of have to wrap it up and speed through the process because there's another emergency to deal with.
Sure. Thanks for that, Tembegile. And I think, as we talk about that, one of the other things that we hardly pay attention to is around anticipatory grief. What this really speaks to is the idea that even before people pass on, there's a grieving process that takes place, which is exactly what you're describing, that when you've lost people, it's quite easy that you'd find yourself in these situations of trying to move on and trying to move on to the next logical step. This often quite happens actually with patients who've maybe come out of ICU, Tembegile, and they've seen people dying in their ward, or they've seen people dying around them. That patient is much more likely to have what we refer to as anticipatory grief, which is a process of really grieving your life while you are still alive because you anticipate death or you anticipate loss. Anticipatory grief is also common when we're looking at people who, work in companies that have been undergoing retrenchments. And so you're constantly wondering, am I next? Am I going to lose my job? What does this really mean? So in as much as you're really trying to cope with a pandemic and trying to survive, there's all this loss that is happening around you. And quite often, it's not loss that we do recognize. So it's not only that people are actually trying to just survive, but people are constantly grieving something as we sort of journey into this pandemic. And I think it's quite important for us to know these distinctions and to actually understand what the meaning of them really is for us at an individual level. I think most people will present with some grief symptoms, but they don't really recognize them as grief symptoms. And so the danger there is that you don't actually know what you're dealing with, and you may not necessarily, have the propensity to actually seek the necessary care. And so it's quite important that people understand that when grief is unrecognized and sort of delegitimized, then it can show up in varying ways. So for example, Tembegile, if I can make an example, I think at a community level, looking at the fact that people have lost income, people have lost jobs, people are really suffering from, a food insecurity of sorts, it's no surprise then that we're seeing a country that is basically witnessing national protests where people are basically looting, in inverted commas, might I say. And for me, that again is quite symptomatic of an unlegitimized or unrecognized form of grief. Because what we know about sort of disenfranchised grief, Tembegile, is that it often shows up as anger. And we know anger is one of the stages of the grieving process. The same applies with anticipatory grief. People are actually anticipating a form of loss and they're grieving in the process, but it's not necessarily recognized. And so it can manifest in varying ways. And so it's quite important that people sort of know these distinctions and are able to see what kind of help or support they need.
And something else that I wasn't aware of, and I'm hearing a lot more of this and reading about it on social media from people who survived COVID and perhaps serious illness. You were referencing people who have been in wards and come out and have seen other patients who lay next to them dying, is the concept, the idea of survivor's guilt and how that impacts a person. How do we address it?
Absolutely. It's a very common phenomenon. And even when we speak about things like black tax, there's often a survivor's guilt that's sort of attached to it, right? And then it's quite important in a case like that, that someone then does a self-introspection and looks at what are the sum of factors that contributed to their survival, what were their risk and protective factors, and to also understand that, because I think quite often that guilt is positioned in the fact that why did I have to survive and why did other people have to pass on? And it's quite important. And again, that guilt is something that's very common within the grieving period. And so one of the ways in which people come out of that guilt is constantly being able to speak with other people, reach out and activating on their social support network and really talking to people. But I think another thing, Tembegile, is a reframing of what we're witnessing, because I think there's a sense of self-blame that comes with what's going on in the country at the moment. And so if you survive, and you are in the same ward as other people who did not survive, you're much more likely to harbor guilt and self-blame to some level. And so it's quite important for people to understand that this is a circumstance we're finding ourselves in, and that you're not solely responsible for any of the consequences relating to the pandemic. Again, I think this is something common when we're talking about the grieving child, Tembegile. Children often internalize death. Children often internalize death, and what that really looks like is them blaming themselves for the passing of a loved one. And so it's quite important for parents to sort of emphasize to a child and speak directly without using euphemisms or anything of the sorts, to be quite direct with children and make them understand that death is not necessarily a consequence of their own behavior.
But what information is too much is what a lot of parents often struggle with when it comes to conversations with children about death.
Sure. So if I'll be honest with you, I think the case isn't often that we're sharing too much information with children. The case is often that we seldom share with children. Children aren't necessarily enabled to share how they feel about death. Spaces aren't necessarily created within households and families for children to really reflect on the psychosocial and emotional impact of death on them. And so I think we're sharing a lot less with children. We tend to speak about death in euphemistic ways, rather than actually explaining to the child what really happened, for the child to really understand as well. One of the other factors, Tembegile, that's quite important to contribute are the sort of cultural or religious nuances around death, right? So, for example, if a household subscribes to a certain religious doctrine, there's nothing wrong with using that to kind of explain or put death into perspective. So telling a child that someone has passed on to go to heaven, etc., if that's a belief system that is held within a household, then that usually helps children to cope, especially when they also identify with that similar doctrine. or if, for example, you're coming from a more traditionalist perspective, speaking about what it means for someone to become an ancestor, the process around that, actually sensitizing children to those processes. And it's quite important that families are then able to use their sort of cultural and religious sort of standpoints or beliefs to actually talk to children about that. So I think to answer your question really directly, I would say we're sharing a lot less with children than we are sharing anymore.
Let's talk about health workers, the people who are right there as people are admitted in whatever condition to hospital. And then sadly, as we've seen now, over 78,000 people have died. Yes, doctors and nurses encounter death regularly in their line of work, but this has not been a regular cycle of experiencing death and witnessing it, even as a professional. How do they begin to walk that journey where yours is a more of a professional relationship, but you are feeling the grief?
Thanks, Tembegile. So you've mentioned doctors and nurses, and I want to give another category of people whose grief has quite often been disenfranchised. And these are counselors, social workers, psychologists, lay counselors. Generally, mental health professionals develop more long-term relationships with their patients or with their clients. And this is a population whose grief is often, not legitimized or recognized or ignored. Now, of course, most practitioners will have a clinical supervisor, which is someone that they actually relay their feelings to and someone that they can talk to about their sort of therapeutic relationships with their clients. But really, this is a space where people tend to actually lose patience. And when that loss happens, no one actually comes back to check on the therapist and how they're doing, or the counselor to see how they're really doing. Now, I think a similar principle applies to most health workers, social workers, or psychologists, that there needs to be a space for debriefing. And this actually needs to be something that is not necessarily seen as a contingency plan, but partly integrated into our mental health and psychosocial support responses for healthcare personnel. The other thing, Tembegile, that's quite important is that relationship with clinical supervisors. It tends to be very much focused on enhancing the practice of the practitioner more than it is actually on really enabling a space for most practitioners to sort of declutter, but also to debrief and reflect on their truest feelings. The other thing, Tembegile, we usually say when we speak amongst my friends that it's quite important, especially for therapists, to have a therapist themselves. Because really the kind of work that you're involved in is quite emotionally heavy. And so it's important for you to have a space that you can then sort of relay your own feelings and emotions about the loss of patients.
Zolani Metu, always good to speak to you. Thank you so much for being on Newsfeed PM.